Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to finish up volume 2 of Capital. Here we're going to look at part 3 today of the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital, which is the last part of the book. Now, before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guignot. If you're new here, welcome. I don't know what you're doing with this 4th episode being the first one you're at, but if you're new here, I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way to make them accessible to you. So if you're new, like, share, subscribe. You'll see videos I release every week, including you can go back and check out however many I have up now, a couple hundred. You can go check those out. If you found this in podcast form, you're going to be able to find it on YouTube, where I sometimes release videos, so that's cool. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it in podcast form, and there shouldn't be any ads, at least for now. I might be out of work soon, and I might need to start monetizing them to make some. Anyways, if you want to help me out, you can do that via Patreon or PayPal, but obviously no pressure. You can help me out by liking, sharing, subscribing, of course. And let's jump into this last part of Capital here. Now, so far in this book, we've been concerned with the individual movement of capital within specific industries. We haven't really considered how industries relate to one another all that much. And in this part, we are going to consider the relationship between industries that Marx homogenizes under the industries that produce the means of production, in contrast to industries that produce the means of consumption. But we're going to get into that as we go on here. Now, the total social capital, from the title of the part, that is the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital, is comprised of the totality of movements of autonomous capitalists, of all the different capitalists and different industries they are capitalists of. So far, we've only, as I said, been concerned really with individual capitalists, individual industries. So money stands in for value, but with the totality or the total of all social capital, what we see is the possibility through expanded reproduction, is the possibility to really move money away from representing value in any coherent way. And he just says kind of quickly here, and there are a few moments throughout the text when he compares the capitalist mode of production to either a collective or a social one. He compares this to a social form of economic development or economic conduct that would do away with money as such, money that just stands in for value and can just expand indefinitely, essentially, with another signifier that would stand in directly for workers' labor, like a credit system or something. At least this is what he puts in place of money. Now, he doesn't actually elaborate on this point here, so it's difficult to know what that would actually look like, because it raises a few alarm bells, and how do you actually assess the value of labor? But in any case, that's what he gives us here. Now, here he returns again to previous ideas about the circulation and reproduction of the total social capital. So again, it's going to be a little bit repetitive, but it's important. So he looks at the Physiocrats once again, specifically Quesnay's Tableau économique, in which it describes production as embodying value put into it through labor, or labor producing value. But this only really comes about through agriculture for the Physiocrats, for Quesnay. So surplus for them comes only from the production and agriculture that brings more from the earth. So as I guess labor gets more efficient for them, I assume, and is able to extract more from the earth, it gets more valuable. But that's not really the case for Marx and Smith, I don't think either, because the more efficient that labor gets, the actually less valuable it is, because it is able to produce more. In a shorter amount of time, it can do things easier. Labor is then less desired. You can hire even fewer laborers. So as for Adam Smith, he believed that total social wealth is presented in 3 ways. He believed they were presented as wages, profit, or rent. So for Smith, the total social capital, which can be understood as the gross revenue, is their total social produce, everything that is produced at the end of the day. Whereas the net revenue, so not the gross revenue, but the net revenue, is what remains after we factor in all the costs of all the capitalists in their respective industries, how much they paid to actually produce the things that came out at the end. Now, this is interesting because Smith is only working in terms of simple reproduction. He's not accounting for costs of actually expanding industry. He's just covering, thinking that capitalists, all they'll do is spend money to cover the costs of their production and all that, and they'll take the rest of the money and enjoy fruitful lives, and that'll be it. Which is why in Adam Smith, it's all about equilibrium. Things will just naturalize themselves. So Marx adds to this entire framework that Smith gives us, adds to wages, profits, and rent, the money that is destined for to be productive capital. Now, Smith presents us with two broad kinds of industries that comprise the totality of all industries. And those are industries that produce the means of production. So these are industries that consumers don't buy from. Everyday workers don't buy from these industries because these industries are producing like coal, or they're producing machines, or they're producing linen that only capitalists are going to use in order to add to their productive forces. They're going to buy coal to work in their factory. They're going to buy linen to turn into shirts or whatever. They're going to buy machines to work in their factory. Now, both of these industries are going to be pumping out products that are going to be bought. Hence, they'll have some bearing on the entire social product. And Smith adds, though, that if you were to actually look at the entire social product, it can all be reduced to variable capital plus surplus value. Constant capital doesn't play a part at all. To which you might say, well, wait. But it costs a capitalist like $1,000 for that machine, and that's going to factor into the cost. So obviously, of the things they produce. So obviously, that's going to have a part in the product. But remember, all products on Earth, all commodities, are reducible to human labor. No commodity just falls down from the sky. Everything can be reduced to the cost of labor that went into it. So let's take one enterprise. Let's look at the production of a car. Each part of the car was brought to that plant or to that industry, to that factory to be put into a car through labor. Each one of those parts of the car were made through labor. So if you go back far enough through any production process in any part of it, you are going to find labor at the very beginning. Labor is what began the entire process. Now, Smith goes wrong, even though he's right about this thing that everything is really reducible to labor or to variable capital plus surplus, which is the added that's taken out of variable capital. But he says then that revenue kind of begins the whole thing, this idea about primitive accumulation. There was some kind of reserve of money that just made everything start going. Now, to say that this is the original part of capitalist accumulation confounds the history of capitalist accumulation. It just gets it totally wrong. The entire revenue of society is then, for Smith, the sum of all the wages paid, that is revenue for workers, plus the surplus value extracted, the revenue for capitalists. So in this way, he only thinks about profit as surplus value that is taken out of workers, as stuff that the capitalists are just going to spend on themselves, on useless things that they'll enjoy, big houses and whatnot. It does not factor into the added exponential portion of that that's going to go back into production in order to expand industry that is going to increase the overall social product, the total social product, or social capital. So his formula only really works in simple reproduction where that type of expansion isn't occurring. So another issue produced from his focus on simple reproduction is that he conflates value of the annual product with the annual value product. So the annual value product, is simply what was produced any year, whereas the former, the value of the annual product, considers the whole value produced in the previous years and that is now also found in new products. And this is such a fascinating idea to me, because when we look at a product that is made, it is not the value of that thing as it is represented in money or as it is represented abstractly in value is not really reducible to the materials that went into that specific thing, or the machines or the wages that went into it. Part of that is found in that product owes its debt to the entire history of capitalist development up until that point. So let's say it was a shoe that uses a specific kind of machine to make the shoe. the value of that shoe is going to be largely predicated upon the entire history of the machine that went into making that shoe and the successive moments of value that went through with that. So shoes have been coming down in price. Well, ostensibly, the trickle-down economic theory, right? Things have been coming down in price, making people have more money to spend on things that they want, yada, yada, yada. Now, this is owed largely to the fact that over the course of history in economic development, the cost of things have been coming down in terms of revolutions in technology that have been making the prices of things come down. So the value of any given thing is not reducible to what went into it like that year. So this is the distinction that Smith gets wrong that Marx fixes, to say that there is a difference between the value of the annual product, which is it is the value of the entire history of capitalist accumulation in that product versus the annual value product. So real living labor that went into making a product is not the only determining factor to a thing's value, because there's all the dead or objectified labor that is still found in the machinery, still found in the raw materials, still found in the developments in labor, how labor is organized, that also will affect and determine the cost, the value of the thing. So then Marx considers a number of other economists who get this stuff way wrong, and I could go through each one of them that he talks about, but the point is that they all just borrow from Smith and they're all wrong. So you can go, if you're so inclined, you can find out about each one of them and how they're wrong. But so thinkers like Proudhon, Mill, Say, these political economists get everything totally wrong because they just uncritically borrow some of these key terms from Smith. So here he considers in much more detail simple reproduction, kind of what Smith took for granted when in fact that's not really the case. So the entire annual product can be traced to constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus. And here we are assuming that the surplus, the revenue for the capitalist, is just that. It's just revenue. It's not actually put back as capital. So in this case, we consider constant plus variable plus surplus value as being the totality of the entire annual product. But again, constant capital can also be understood as variable capital plus surplus value, because every single thing of constant capital, be it a building, be it raw materials, machinery, whatever, they're all reducible to the labor that went into them. It's just that this knowledge isn't readily available to the capitalist. They only know the cost they paid for the machine at that time. They don't necessarily know if that actually reflects the history of that machine, because the capitalist who sold that machine might have done their math wrong, or whoever did the math might have done their math wrong, in which case it might not actually reflect it. So the capitalist just has to take the price they paid for the machine or the building or whatever as being that price. And this then stands in for C, for the constant capital here, plus the variable capital, plus the surplus. So of the entire social capital, as I've already mentioned, there are those industries that build the means of production versus industries that produce the means of consumption. So let's assume this is the totality of all social production. You have industries on one side, we'll call them industry one, producing the means of production. They make machines, they make houses or buildings, they make raw materials that average everyday workers never buy. So this industry is reserved for capitalists. So capitalists from the means of production industry are going to buy from here, and as well, the capitalists of the means of consumption industry are going to buy from there as well. So on the other hand, we have the means of consumption industry. These are industries that are going to produce food. They're going to produce shelter for people. So workers are actually going to only buy, and I say only, but 99% of the time in this framework, they're only going to buy from the sellers of the means of consumption. So what that means then is that the means of production create the possibility for the means of consumption to some extent, because the means of consumption capitalists have to buy machinery, buildings from the means of production capitalists that they can then employ in their own business in the means of consumption so that they can sell products to workers from both the means of consumption and the means of production. So capitalists buy from both industries. They buy from the means of consumption because they need to buy food. They need to buy shelter. And they also buy from the means of production, to buy machinery for their own business. Whereas workers will buy only from the means of consumption. They only buy from that area that sells products that they can afford, because they probably can't afford their own factory. So workers from the means of production earn a wage from the capitalists of the means of production that the workers then go over to the means of consumption factories or factories, industries, and buy food from them, buy shelter or whatever. And the same applies to the means of consumption industries. So capitalists of the means of consumption pay workers who then spend money in that industry. And it's a very good trick, like for a business to do this. If a business is able to make their workers buy from them exclusively, what is happening is the money that they're paying out to workers just comes right back to them. It's really quite genius. And I remember when I was younger, I used to work, for any Canadians out there, I used to work at Tim Hortons. And there were people that that were workers there that would hang out at Tim Hortons. And at the time, I remember thinking you're just giving your money right back to them, right? You just worked 8 hours and you're still here buying food. They're laughing all the way to the bank because you were just exploited. And now you're giving that little bit you have left over right back to them. Now that's a very specific example. Really the point that Marx is making here is looking at the entirety of all industries that produce the means of consumption to kind of make an abstract whole, a homogeneous whole out of it. And then saying that all people, and he's right about this, earning wages, don't make a lot of money, can only buy from them. So people working in those industries of the means of consumption are always only giving their money right back to the very capitalists that bought their labor power. So if the products of the means of production, so building machines, factories, whatever, if the products there are bought by the means of consumption and by other industries in the means of production, like let's say a factory focuses on building machines, another one focuses on building buildings, whatever, they're going to buy from each other. All of the means of consumption industries need to buy from the means of production industries. So all the constant capital of the means of consumption industries, buildings, factories, machines, all that stuff, comes from the means of production. So the product of the means of production is the same thing as the constant capital of the means of consumption, which is an added point that we're going to build on in a little bit. Now, the means of consumption industries can be broken up into two broad groups. There are the means of consumption industries that make the necessary stuff for everyone, but then there are luxury ones, because capitalists want to separate themselves from the plebs, right? They don't want to associate with the regular folk, and so they're going to do that by adorning themselves with different clothing or with jewelry or whatever that they can only acquire from certain industries. Now, the existence of luxury industries among the means of consumption industries more generally, it has to be less than the necessary means of consumption industries. Because if there was more labor being put into means of consumption for luxury goods, that means that there would be fewer people or fewer industries actually making the requisite or the necessary amount of necessities for everybody. And so people would just die. So like the case of the means of production industries, where the workers get paid and then they run over to the means of consumption industries to buy bread and shelter, very much within the means of consumption industries in the luxury areas, those workers are going to take their money and then run over to the means of consumption of necessary goods and buy food and shelter there. Now, a point that Marx extracts from this is to say that a sum of value equal to the total surplus value is realized in the consumption fund. That is the amount circulating that people are going to be using to spend money on. But given just the impossibility of properly assessing certain needs, There could be a boom in population in which the demand is increased. There could be a reduction in population, like with the Black Plague, where the demand has gone way down, but the supply is way too high. It's so easy for things to go awry. Crises are going to unfold, and crises are then going to lead to equilibrium, but they'll come to equilibrium after people have died, after people have gone hungry, and, horrible things have occurred. Now, in all of this, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that laborers, workers, are the originators of value, because they're just, as I'm framing it here, they're only being bought by capitalists who seem to already have valuable capital, as though they are the originators of capital, when in fact, of course, it is the workers. Now, if the means of production supply the means of consumption industries with their constant capital, with their factories, with their machines and so on, where does the constant capital of the means of production come from? Unless it takes it from another means of production industry, but where did they get it from? Where did this all originate from? And again, this is a kind of mystery that haunts this text. And, capitalism seems to presuppose itself, insofar as variable capital and the surplus value taken out of it has to be spent somewhere when it is made, which would imply that there's an entire productive apparatus already in existence that are making objects of consumption that the capitalist can spend money on. So if we accept that the product of the MOP, or the MOP of the means of production, as I have in my notes written, abbreviated as MOP, the MOP, God, if the product of the means of production is what is transformed into the constant capital of the means of consumption, then that means that the variable capital plus the surplus value, which is the product of the means of production industries, that means then that is exactly the same thing as the constant capital in the means of consumption industries, which means that the entire social product, if it is reducible to variable capital plus surplus value at the end of the day of all the industries, and we know that the variable capital plus the surplus value is in the product of the means of production, is the exact same as the constant capital in the means of consumption, then therefore the entire social product can be broken down into the constant capital in the means of consumption plus its variable plus its surplus value, all in the means of consumption. Now, we can only really do this when we think of the total social character, because it erases the real production that goes on in the means of production, and it erases the fact that we are dealing with simple reproduction here in Adam Smith's fairy tale world, where things will always be sold for the price they want to be sold for, and everything just works out perfectly. If we don't assume that, though, in the means of production industry, not everything gets sold to the means of consumption industry. Some of it won't be sold, but that doesn't mean it won't be sold in the future, in another year, and will then make up the product then. Just because it hasn't been sold in this 1 year is just, anyways, yeah. So this here again, he says this is what separates capitalism from other economic systems, in that capitalist economy invested in production. The capitalist economy invests in production that won't immediately translate to revenue, and that only exists as capital, and it also offers more for some than need actually demands. That is, it forms a stock so that there's going to be more supply than demand, which is untenable because that'll lead to a crisis where there's the demand will go down to nothing. There's all this stock that's just not being used, and then the capitalist won't be able to employ workers, and it's just going to be a terrible cycle. Now, in the relationship between the means of production industries and the means of consumption industries, there is an issue that emerges. Because if the means of consumption industries are only selling or only buying the means of production products, that is the factory, the machines, everything like that, to use as their own constant capital, and they're paying their workers like $100, let's say the total sum given to workers is $100, that $100 is going to come right back to them, of which they're going to make $100 surplus. How do we actually account for the cost of covering wear and tear of this machinery, assuming that it's not going to be put back into capital as capital in the case of simple reproduction? Because these machines aren't going to last forever, of course. And let's not forget either that all the workers are going to be going to the means of consumption to actually earn the money that they earn, the food that they need, and the shelter. So in that case, they are screwing over all the buyers who are workers, who are paying more than they are earning from the industry of the means of production, which means that they're going to have to get paid more in the means of production industry to cover these higher costs, which is going to keep us at a state of equilibrium that isn't actually going to account for the possibility of handling wear and tear, of handling other costs. And so what we see produced here is just an endless cycle of capitalism trying to cover the costs of its own deficits, which is why, you look at any country and there's these inordinate, exorbitant deficits, and makes no sense. Like, how does this actually proceed the way that it does? And I know that this is kind of a high school kid, like, first learning about this thing, like, oh wow, the debt, like, it can't be sustainable. Obviously there are economic explanations for why it is sustainable. I'm not saying that, but it should raise some eyebrows as to how such a thing can be sustainable. But in any case, that's just me. Someone yell at me in the comments and tell me why I'm wrong. So it might remedy this by using foreign trade. So instead of paying for things in one country, it'll then look to another country and acquire some more wealth that it will then apply to its industry in order to cover these costs. But all this does is it transfers the contradictions of capitalism globally. So it might fix the problem momentarily at home, but it has just sent the problem overseas. And it always seems as though capitalists acquire money for free in this whole thing, not just through surplus value, but if you have workers going from the means of production to the means of consumption to buy things, and they are paying more for it than they are earning, then the means of production capitalists are saving, and the means of consumption capitalists are earning more. And then they're just, it's like the capitalists are just feeding each other their own money that they're giving to the workers, who are steadily deteriorating. They're steadily being more and more exploited. Meanwhile, the capitalists are essentially throwing money at one another that's being mediated through the workers. Now, this also reveals another problem. So let's say that capitalists pay workers $100 total, and they want to extract $200 of surplus from it. So they'll charge $200 for the product, assuming that that's the case. But workers only have the means to buy $100 worth of products. So all the capitalist is doing is just getting their money right back. They aren't earning more, which is just a mystery as to how accumulation can actually occur, how growth can actually occur. But anyways, he just presents this mystery and then leaves us with it. So now he considers, in not enough detail, in my opinion, accumulation and reproduction on an extended scale. So he's not just thinking about simple reproduction here. So when surplus value is created in production and those commodities are sold, the surplus money is held onto by the capitalists as a hoard. They aren't putting it back into their industry. So in such a system, we can't really understand why people buy at all, because that would only diminish that hoard, because they wouldn't have their hoard anymore if they're out buying things for themselves. So if we remember with the means of production and the means of consumption and simple reproduction, the means of production bought products from the means of consumption. So capitalists and workers from the means of production had to buy their subsistence and luxuries from the means of consumption. And that means of consumption then used that money to cover the costs of their constant and variable capital, which would just feed back into the means of production. And we have this cycle going on and on and on. Now, in a system of extended reproduction or accumulation and reproduction on an extended scale, what we actually see is the capitalists of the means of production, instead of giving their total product to the capitalists of the means of consumption, they're going to hold on to a bit of it that they're going to put into their own business to expand it. So now the capitalists of the means of consumption are getting less than they had previously, which it's going to reveal its own mysteries in itself. But that is the only way in which the originator, ostensibly, of this process, the means of production, are going to be able to grow themselves. And with this, we see supply increase and the supply of money increase on like an exponential scale. And he uses a term here, he calls this virtual constant capital. And I actually don't know how this term works here. I don't know the German word, but we could think of it in a few different ways. It can be a kind of haunting constant capital, a mysterious one. It could be a constant capital that has less of an attachment to value than it once did, or so on, whatever. So despite the appearance of expanded reproduction as bigger, it is only really bigger relatively. We still have the same value circulating, but that value is circulating among more products. Now, in the case of industries such as the means of production and means of consumption industries, we are confronted with an issue on how they both expand. So, as I said, if the means of production gives only a smaller portion to the means of consumption industries, then that means that it's going to be harder for the means of consumption industries to actually grow. Well, one possible solution, and this is probably something Adam Smith would say, would just be to decrease wages. And then the capitalists of the means of consumption will then make more money. But the problem that will arise then is that workers will just die and there won't be a supply of workers to work for you, because you can't just superficially or artificially decrease wages. They have to follow a certain equilibrium. They have to follow the real value of wages in order not to lead to disequilibrium, so that people can actually live. Now, one possible explanation for this that Marx only kind of entertains is that in the capitalist mode of production, capitalists aren't always successful. They often fail. In fact, a lot of the time they fail. And when they fail, what that means is that they gave more than they received, which means that somewhere down the line, someone has earned more money. Another capitalist has earned more money. So that might explain how some industries are able to just kind of keep growing, while others can sink, because there's always going to be losers even among the capitalist class. And I think that gets lost a bit, because he does address it, and he says that there are going to be losers, but it'll just mean that their riches are a little less rich. But that doesn't account for the fact that there are very many losers who are giving up more than they're actually taking in, which is a deficit, is a negative, to in some sense balance out some of the positives. At least this is one possible explanation as to how this mystery can be resolved. But of course, there's still like the inordinate growth of wealth. I can't explain that. But this is one hypothesis. For anyone who has a better background of economics, I'd love to hear about what you'd have to say about this. Now, in terms of the actual use or the application of surplus value to expansion, it can't just happen by throwing it at constant capital. So the means of consumption industry doesn't just take the profits that it makes and throws it at the means of production industry to buy more machines. They also need to buy more labor power in order to work those machines, or they need to buy more raw materials in terms of circulating capital and so on. Now, this is what the entire process might look like. Hypothetically, here's just an example. Let's say we have a means of production industry. The totality of all the industries has $1,000 or $1,000 worth of constant capital working, and they produce, or they give $500 to their workers among the whole industry. So let's assume an exploitation rate of 100%, surplus value rate of 100%. They then make 500 in surplus value. So to reiterate, they have 1,000 as C, 500 as V, variable capital, plus 500 as surplus. So a total of 2,000. Now, if you recall, the constant capital of the means of consumption is going to be equal to the product of the means of production. That means, because the means of production is really just V plus S, variable capital, plus the surplus extracted from it, which was 500 and 500, then the means of production, or the constant capital of the means of consumption, is going to be 1,000 as well. Now, this was a case of simple reproduction. Let's imagine instead of that 1,000, which is the V plus the S of the means of production, instead of that 1,000 going into the means of consumption, 900 goes into it. So now the capitalist of the means of production keeps 100 for themselves that they apply to their own industry to expand it. So in order to cover that lost cost, because the means of consumption still want the 1,000, they're going to have to find that 1,000, that 100 to make up that cost somewhere else. So they might charge it to their, they might take it out of their surplus value, out of the revenue, whatever, to cover that cost. But here we can't actually explain for their growth, right? Their actual expansion. And it might actually need to be more than 100, right? Because we can't forget, and I just forgot, but we can't forget that some has to then go to variable capital as well. So it might instead be 120. So 100 will go to the constant capital, and then 20 will have to go to the variable capital in order to have workers that are going to work with these new machines or these new means of production within the means of consumption and so on. Now, this 20 that goes to variable capital can be valorized, right? As we understand variable capital to be the site of valorization. Let's say again at 100%, then it produces $20, 20 extra dollars upon the cost that it has now added to the means of consumption. So $20, if we assume still this 1-to-5 ratio or 1-to-6 ratios we had, were $20 in variable capital, where we had 100 go into constant capital, so 1-to-5, and this 20 produces 20 in surplus. This 20 in surplus to cover the costs now is going to have to just go back into the system to cover, to put $16 into, or like $17 into constant capital while putting 4 into variable capital. And so what we get here is just this kind of simple reproduction occurring once again, where we can't explain this possibility for growth, at least not very clearly. And it's on that note that he kind of abruptly ends the book. And it wasn't his book, it was his notes that Engels had compiled into a book, where he says that essentially we're going to be confronted with capitalists who form these hordes in terms of like simple reproduction, not actually expanding their industries. And then we have those that are going to be accumulating money and expanding their industry. And for someone who takes on this issue in a lot of detail, there's Rosa Luxemburg, and I think her book is called The Accumulation of Capital. And I remember years ago I presented on this in a seminar, and it was difficult because very much like I was doing today, but in a lot more detail, I was presenting all the mathematical equations, which was a challenge, to say the least. Anyways, yeah, that pretty much rounds out the second volume of Capital. If anyone made it this far, I really applaud you. You know, I'm sorry this has to go on for 4 episodes, but I don't see another way other than having like hour and 20 long minute episodes or something, and that would be not so good. I don't think, at least. I don't know, it might be better. Who knows? If you like what I did, I'd love to hear about it. You know, you can like, share, subscribe. You can contribute via Patreon or PayPal if you're interested in that at all. If I got anything wrong as well, I would love to hear about it. And yeah, thanks for listening this far, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.